Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, Illinois Channel Executive Director Terry Martin talks with David Jordan at the Medill School of Journalism's Washington Bureau about a potential government shutdown. Then in about 10 minutes from now, State Senator Jason Barickman holds a press conference to discuss his two bills to create an evidence-based school funding formula. Following that, in about 40 minutes from now, we sit down with Rob Karl, the president and CEO of the Illinois Retail Merchants Association, as he explains why his association and other retailers oppose increasing the retail theft felony threshold. And finally, in about 1 hour from now, we talk to Taylor Pensoneau, a former reporter with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who covered Illinois politics, about his recollections of certain Illinois politicians, why nothing is getting done in Springfield, the effect of Illinois political power being concentrated in Chicago, and his advice for aspiring journalists. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our advisory council members.
Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. Since 1985, we've worked to educate the public and those who serve as trustees and pension boards about issues that impact the financial health of publicly funded pensions. Our members manage over $18 billion in pension assets. That's a huge number. But we never forget those dollars belong to the men and women who've worked as firefighters, police officers, and as educators. We want them to know that their pension dollars are safely invested. They also want to know that someone will keep an eye on legislation that could threaten their pension. And that's why the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association is fighting against laws that would reduce the pensions earned by our members. And this is why we support the work of the Illinois Channel. Their unbiased, in-depth coverage of the pension reform issue allows us and our members to hear arguments on both sides of the pension issue, to follow legislation as it moves through committee, or to hear unedited interviews with key lawmakers as they discuss what changes are being considered. Pensions are very important. They're also very complex. Pension reform can't adequately be covered in sound bites. But the Illinois Channel provides a connection to the Capitol, the governor, and lawmakers that we all need to stay on top of key issues. Hi, I'm Jim McNamee, President of the Illinois Public Pension Fund Association. I watch the Illinois Channel, and I hope you do too.
I'm here at Reagan National Airport, where passengers here and around the world are reacting to the viral video from the man who was dragged brutally off of the United Airlines flight. Millions have seen the videos of Dr. David Dow, who was forcibly removed by security when he refused to give up his seat to United employees. Dr. Dow lost his 2 front teeth, suffered a broken nose, and a concussion. His lawyers and daughter spoke to the press for the first time this morning.
Airlines, United in particular, have bullied us.
After seeing the video, a congresswoman from Illinois is taking up the case of flyers and writing legislation that will prevent a similar incident in the future.
My legislation that I'm working on right now would say there's no more involuntary bumping. That's over. The airline has to continue to offer to get volunteers whatever that price is.
Congresswoman Schakowsky's plan will also require that bumping must happen before the plane is boarded. Passengers we spoke with today are split on whether or not they will continue to fly with United.
Until they change their ways, until they really put some things in place that protect the passengers, because the passengers are what make them successful.
I've been flying United a long time, and I'm fine. That wouldn't cause me to change.
The Congresswoman adds that she is optimistic that she will be able to get bipartisan support on this bill when Congress is back in session.
The reason I'm hopeful has been the outrage that I have seen from people who have watched the video.
Reporting for the Illinois Channel from Washington, I'm Mariana Brady.
Just ahead, Illinois Channel Executive Director Terry Martin talks with David Jordan at the Medill School of Journalism's Washington Bureau about a potential government shutdown. This runs about 10 minutes.
David Jordan, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel, and you are coming to us today from Washington, D.C., and we wanted to be talking to you about an issue that, with all the other news going on lately, the people may not have picked up on, and that is that the government, the federal government, could be facing a shutdown at the end of the month. Can you give us a background on what's happening and why?
So Congress is currently on recess, but when they get back in session, they'll have a week to fund the federal government. The budget currently only goes through April 28th, and if they don't pass anything by then on April 29th, the government will not open up. Roughly 850,000 employees would be furloughed, and people in essential positions like air traffic controllers or FBI agents would have to show up to work not knowing when their next paycheck may come.
So the federal government, their fiscal year starts on October 1st and runs through the end of September. But I am correct, I believe, in that the government is not operating on a full-year budget right now, and that's really the reason why. So what we're facing a continuing resolution, or we're operating, I guess, right now on a continuing resolution. Is that correct?
Yes, so instead of passing a complete budget, they are using a continuing resolution, which makes it so that they're operating on the previous year's budget, and the agencies are not able to readjust their spending. It's not very popular with the agencies. The Joint Chiefs of Staff referred to having to operate on a continuing resolution as professional malpractice.
So what is the holdup as far as just the Republicans are in control of both houses of Congress and the White House? Why don't they just pass another continuing resolution to keep the government funded through the end of September?
So the big sticking point is the Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney suggested that congressional representatives in the Republican caucus should add language to the continuing resolution that would defund sanctuary cities. It's not very popular with the Democrats, and they do need Democratic votes for sure in the Senate, where it could potentially face a filibuster, and probably in the House to get a continuing resolution through both chambers and onto President Trump's desk.
Now, we recently famously heard this whole issue about the filibuster, and when Justice Neil Gorsuch was approved, the Republicans got rid of the filibuster for the Supreme Court nominees. What is the situation on the filibuster on something like this? Is it still applicable?
So the filibuster would be applicable. They did not get rid of the filibuster entirely. It only applied to court appointees like Neil Gorsuch. So in effect, they need 60 votes instead of the 51 to get it through the Senate.
And in the past, the Republicans have often been blamed for, under President Clinton and under President Obama, often the Republicans have faced the blame for shutting down the government. I would expect that this time it's almost surely going to fall on the Republicans, since they control both houses of Congress. On the other hand, the Democrats, as you say, are objecting to the sanctuary city provision. Have you talked to anyone as far as how politically this would play out?
So Minority Whip Dick Durbin has suggested that the Republicans would again face a lot of the scrutiny if the government does shut down. During the last government shutdown in 2013, approval of Republicans fell dramatically after the shutdown. Although the policy of sanctuary cities is not particularly popular, about 80% of Americans disapprove of sanctuary cities, even if the policies are pretty popular in the cities themselves, like Chicago.
And on the other hand, we do have the example that federal law is preeminent over state and local law. And has there been any discussion, or have you talked to anyone as far as how the law, the legal standing of these cities who want to be violating the federal provisions on immigration?
So it is a point of contention. It hasn't I don't know too much about how it's been challenged myself, but the largely democratic cities that are not sharing their immigration statistics with the federal government have been doing it for quite a few years. The Obama administration did not really choose to challenge them on that fact, but it was a big campaign promise of President Trump's to be tougher on immigration than his predecessor.
And then the other thing, I mean, as we speak, there's a couple of weeks left in the month, but right now the Congress is out of session. They're on their Easter break, so there's not really as many legislative days as we might think before they face a shutdown. When actually would the government shut down? You say, is it right at the end of the month?
So the government is funded through April 28th. So the shutdown would begin essentially at midnight on the 29th if they do not pass anything in the week of legislative days they have.
And we know in the past some of these government shutdowns sometimes they can last a couple of days, they could last longer. The government was shut down several times back in the 1990s when Bill Clinton was the president and the Republicans had the House. So I guess there's really no way that we can tell, but what people might want to know, of course, at federal parks and those kind of things, sometimes they're shut down, which is probably more of an inconvenience to people on their vacations trying to see Washington or some of the federal parks than many times a real practical application. The other thing I would say to people that there's, not to be confused, another issue coming up that could also force, I guess, the government shutdown is we're running up against the debt ceiling limit, but just to make clear, that's a different issue entirely, right?
Yeah, so they're not explicitly connected. I believe in the past they have tried to group it with the more fiscal conservative side of the Republican Party, but they are two different issues, not grouped together.
Well, David Jordan, we appreciate you taking the time to give us the background on this. With all the big news breaking of recent days, I think it's one of the issues that's very significant, but has really maybe not gotten the play that it should have. And we thank you for joining us and filling us in.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Take care.
Next, from Springfield, State Senator Jason Barickman holds a press conference to discuss his two bills to create an evidence-based school funding formula. This runs about 25 minutes.
So, good afternoon. We've spent, seems like years now, talking about school funding reform, and there's lots of good reasons for that. I think we're all aware at this point of how broken the school funding system is. I'm not going to recite all of what's been said over the years about our broken school funding formula and system. We're aware of that. We're aware of the detrimental effects of things like proration to our school districts and our children. And I think as many people are aware, I've been an advocate of an evidence-based school funding model for a long time. In fact, I first introduced legislation that embraces the evidence-based model back in February of 2015. We couldn't even get a committee hearing on it back then. Fast forward to today, and I think we've seen a lot of meaningful progress on embracing the evidence-based funding model. In fact, there's a lot of people who are coalescing around this model, and I think that's a good sign, whether you see it from members of both political parties, members of both chambers, and I think we're starting to see positive signs come out of the governor's office. To me, these are all good signs. I want to point specifically to some of the work that is being done today in the Illinois House and is being led by Representative Will Davis. Will Davis has introduced legislation that embraces the evidence-based funding model, and I commend him for that effort. As some of you are aware, I served with Will when I was in the House. His district is quite different from mine. The area of the state for which he serves in is very different than mine. But Representative Davis has always shown himself to be an advocate of educational issues. I think that he has demonstrated in his involvement on the Governor's School Funding Commission that he has a significant understanding of the evidence-based model. And as a member of the Illinois House of Representatives, I think it's important that we're now seeing support for the evidence-based model, because I have always said, and I think others have always said, if we're going to change the law on this issue, it's going to take bipartisanship, it's going to take bicameral action, and it's going to take support from the governor of our state. So in all those regards, I'm pleased to see the work that Representative Davis has done. His work is not yet complete. I think there are further things that we need to do on the evidence-based model, but I think he's got a good start. I spoke to him, in fact, just earlier today and talked about the work that he's doing. We talked about some of the differences of opinion that we may have on the legislation that moves forward. And so part of today and what I plan to do this week is to introduce legislation in the Senate in the form of amendments to Senate Bills 1124 and 1125 that will put in legislation my ideas on how we enact the evidence-based model. It's 2 amendments, and collectively those amendments both implement the evidence-based funding system and provide to school districts the tools they need to reduce their costs and give their districts flexibility. This legislation in the Senate brings us a lot closer to parity, which has been an issue that has been discussed at length. Parity, of course, is the notion that there's an equal or a level playing field for school districts. Oh, sorry. Touching the mic. So Senate Bill 1124, as amended, will be the introduction of the evidence-based funding model. The evidence-based model embraces the framework established by the Illinois School Funding Reform Commission for reforming the current school funding formula. I think people are beginning to become familiar with this model. It uses 27 elements to determine a unique adequacy target based on school district, demographics, and best practices, all as reflected in educational research and through consensus expert opinion. Adequacy targets are established which reflect the particular needs of children in each district and will lead to improved outcomes for students. This is a significant shift in education policy from the foundation level formula that we have today, which applies to all school students in all districts, and instead moves us towards a unique district adequacy target, again, based on the uniqueness of an individual school district. We then distribute money to those who need it the most, or those who, or better said, those who are the furthest from their individual adequacy target. We allocate additional resources as needed for children with disabilities, for children who are English learners, children who live in families that are considered low income, and children who live in areas of concentrated poverty. We incorporate means testing to drive more money to schools that are in districts with high taxes and low property wealth, or EAV. We utilize and embrace a hold harmless, or a base funding minimum, which means that school districts aren't going to lose money, and we establish then a per pupil hold harmless. So as enrollment is adjusted, so does the hold harmless. By doing so, we create a funding base and we protect districts as they move forward. This gives them an ability to plan and transition smoothly. It also recognizes the political realities of running legislation on school funding, which is people look at spreadsheets and they want to know how the districts in their legislative district play out. Thus, the hold harmless is an important component of this. Now, what's important here, again, is recognizing that Illinois has often been criticized as having one of the widest equity gaps in school funding in the entire nation. So, as money is added to the evidence-based model, we distribute it first to those districts who are furthest from adequacy. This is important in a historical context because if you look at just the last 3 years in Illinois, we have allocated or appropriated more than $1 billion to Illinois school districts, all done through the current funding system. We incorporate new spending transparency that should be understandable to the average person. This gives taxpayers a better understanding between the local contributions they make via property taxes as well as their district's ability to meet their own unique adequacy target. We create a professional review panel that will make recommendations to improve the formula and its implementation in 3 years. And then we embrace things that result from the Governor's Reform Commission, like ensuring equitable funding for charter schools. We repeal the Chicago Block Grant, which has a number of effects, including the elimination of proration of the mandated categoricals for every other school district in the state. This is a significant impact. We tie the legislation to pension parity, a request, as we know, of many legislators, Democrats, has been pension parity for CPS. By tying to Senate Bill 2172, which is the pension parity legislation, we create a situation where although CPS may lose money through the block grant, they in effect get it back through pension parity. We tie to Senate Bill 1125, that's the other one that I'm introducing here or amending here today, which incorporates mandate relief and management flexibility. This is mandate relief for all school districts. Again, it ties to the notion that we need to implement parity. Together, collectively, these bills provide real parity in terms of funding, pension costs, and management flexibility. The result is we're treating all schools the same, which has been a big driver of opinions throughout both parties, both chambers, and the legislature. Where we go from here, I think, is, the legislature, of course, is not convened this week or next, but when we return, I hope to have a committee hearing on this legislation. I think that the time is right for us to hear the evidence-based model in the Senate, and I'm prepared to present it in committee when we return. With that, I want to turn to all of you for questions.
Senator, we're halfway through the session, and you just kind of touched on it. Do you think that it is possible to get the formula changed by the end of this session?
I think it's possible. It's going to, again, it will take actions. It'll take bipartisan action, and it's going to take bicameral action. Look, the coming 6 weeks of the legislative cycle are notoriously when the most significant action is taken in the legislative process. So I'm hopeful that we can see this then and certainly enact it right away.
Senator, how does your proposal differ from Senator Menard's and Representative Davis's?
Well, I can't, Senator Menard has multiple iterations of a school funding bill this year, so I can't speak to. Right. Senate Bill 1, I believe, my last count had 3 amendments, each of which was maybe 400 or 500 pages long. So let me shift to, again, Will Davis, which I touched on in my opening comments. I think Will Davis's bill, which is House Bill 2808, I think your question is really a question of how do we differ from it, because that's the answer I suppose I'm going to give here is towards that. There's a number of key differences. I think how we handle the block grant is a significant component. The notion that we're removing the block grant but picking up the CPS pension cost, I think, is unique to how we approach that issue here. Representative Davis's bill has some components that drive up the cost of implementing the program. There's a difference in how I approach some of those. And then there's a whole bunch of technical but important issues that I think will likely be resolved, whether it be class sizes, how we utilize technology and weight those components. Representative Davis has his ideas, I've got mine. I think the important thing here is we're all communicating. When I spoke to Will this morning, he said that he anticipates some amendments to his legislation based on some of the feedback that he's had. He suggested that he'll look at what we're filing, but I think these give us some baselines to work from. Obviously, I think there will be a lot of attention on what's the differences, and I try to highlight those here. But my hope is that the two sides will resolve those differences, that we can come to the middle and come to an agreement on them.
Senator, so you're going to have hold harmless in the first year,
and then in the second year, you won't have hold harmless.
No. Go ahead. I'll clarify that. But
if we do have hold harmless, and based on your 4-tier system, based on need, are you talking about additional monies that would be spent on education above the current levels, that those extra funds would be applied to the 4-tier system based on need?
So here's how I approach it. First, in year one, now, there's a hold harmless that says we don't want to take away money from a school district and put legislators who are going to be asked to vote on this in the situation that has killed these ideas previously, which is looking at a spreadsheet with red lines on it. So we incorporate a hold harmless immediately. As we move forward, one of the things that I think we've all learned is that a hold harmless that is not adjusted for enrollment creates unintended consequences. So as we move forward and districts see gains or losses in enrollment, their hold harmless level would also then be adjusted.
Tied to student population instead of just total revenue.
That's right. We've had school districts throughout the state who have seen significant declines in enrollment. I think there's some of our suburban districts are seeing some very significant declines in enrollment. So it doesn't make sense to lock in a number as a hold harmless level and lock that into perpetuity. Instead, we said let's start with where we're at today, but then make adjustments for enrollment so that those districts aren't seeing windfalls of state dollars as they lose enrollment.
Now, how does categorical spending fit into all this?
So maybe clarify your question.
Well, you have per pupil spending, then you have categorical spending such as school bus transportation, which in rural areas
yes,
you have a low student population, but you're going to have high school bus costs.
So the
on the hold harmless, are we talking just about per pupil funding, or do we look at the total cost operating school?
Yeah, the hold harmless really is a reflection of the funding formula. The categoricals which lie outside the formula, things like transportation and other categories, are treated in the same way with one exception, one significant exception. Today, school districts throughout the state apply for those mandated categorical dollars by making claims to the state. There's a process for which they work through. What we are saying is by removing the Chicago block grant, CPS will continue to make their claims, but instead of just getting money off the top, they're going to have to make claims just like every other school district. So we leave that alone outside the formula.
Do you foresee that creating a political speed bump as far as getting this passed with the Chicago?
Well, no, I mean, the two things that I've heard through all of our negotiations, conversations on this with the Governor's Commission and beyond are, number one, actually this predates the Governor's Commission. There has been a bipartisan desire to remove the Chicago block grant. That, I believe, was an outcome of the EFAC committee, and it's certainly been said by many members of the legislature on both sides of the aisle. Also said is the desire of legislators to not have scenarios where districts lose money through a change in the formula. That's why I approached it this way of saying with Chicago, who stands to lose money if you remove the block grant, but they stand to gain money when the state picks up their pension costs. So by tying them together, my hope is to address both concerns.
Do you know offhand, is that a net gain or a net loss for them?
Well, we haven't run the numbers. You know, the block grant adjusts itself every year. The amount of the overage of the block grant is a moving target, as is the pension pickup. So, but I think they're close. They're both in that $200 million range. But when you combine those along again with the hold harmless, the result is there's no losers, including CPS.
And on with 1125, I guess, mandates,
mm-hmm.
do we know which mandates that would apply to?
Sure. The mandate relief is PE, driver's ed, third-party contracting. There's also some management rights and tools that currently are given to CPS that are then applied to every other district throughout the state.
Are those about collective bargaining, or what management rights and tools?
So the management rights and tools are things like, again, some are similar. CPS has available in law today a very specific provision that applies only to that school district. Rather than revise the guts of what it does, we've simply removed the provision that says this only applies to CPS, thereby applying it to any other school district. It involves decisions to contract with third parties, decisions to lay off or reduce and force employees, class sizes, staffing and assignments, decisions concerning use and staffing of experimental pilot programs, etc.
So with you mentioned class size, do you foresee any unintended consequences of, like, maybe a class goes up to like 35?
I think we already have class sizes that are 35. I mean, that's a product today of things that are decided both locally and a result of funding levels. So, you know, the goal here is to get funding to the districts which are most in need. That need, again, based on their adequacy target determined by looking at a district, you know, and its unique self and saying, what are the student population, what resources are available locally, what do we need as a district to provide our children an adequate educational opportunity, and then having the state fill that gap for those districts most in need first.
It also says you could give schools the ability to get rid of unfunded mandates via referendum. Are any unfunded mandates going to be off limits? You know, a lot of, like, we had the districts down here last week, and they said, you know, we don't want to get rid of unfunded mandates. A lot of them are, you know, really good goals to have. But
yeah, there's always going to be, I think, a separation between those things which are required by federal law, those things that might be health, life, and safety issues. But I think what we've continually seen from school districts is even once you set those types of mandates aside, there are numerous other mandates, some of which are new creatures of the legislature each year, that are imposing on them an obligation to do more even though we're not sending them more money. And so we're trying to give some flexibility on those. The referendum piece allows for more local control on those decisions. So it doesn't mean that a school district necessarily is going to do away with the mandates that we're releasing them from, but gives the school district a tool through local control to make decisions that are best for their school district.
Are you in communication with the governor's office on this? Do you think that they will endorse your plan or any of that?
So we've had a lot of conversations with the specifically Beth Purvis, the governor himself. I think the governor, my perception is that he's moved a long way since he was sworn into office and has come to understand better the issue and the proposals that we're all working on here. I don't know what their opinion will be on this bill. They haven't seen it yet. But we're going to put it out there and receive feedback from all sorts of groups and people who are important to the legislative process. Obviously, getting support and a signature from the governor is a key component to passing a bill like this, but it's got to work its way through the legislative process, first.
Is there any, with the whole harmless and what you're trying to do, is there any estimated cost either globally, and I assume you don't have a district by district sheet that all the legislators will look at yet, but do you have either of those, either the local or kind of, I think the NARS thing was going to cost $600 million a year, et cetera.
Yeah, I think there's two things here. Number one, when you start with the premise of we're just going to look at what we're doing today and call that a baseline, that doesn't cost any money, right? As we move forward, I think there's going to be some political decisions that are made. They're budgetary decisions. How much money are we going to put into a new formula, and what are the effects of that? I think those are all those are budget and political decisions that just will be made, through that process. This just gives us the tool to do it, and it starts from the standpoint of where we're at today.
Senator, where are educators at with this particular plan, or administrators or superintendents? I mean, did you consult with any of them about, hey, this is what I'm thinking about doing, what would you like? I mean, how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, there's an incredible history here, you know, that dates back to 2015 when we were all talking about funding reform, and really the education community approached me then and said, we'd like you to look at this evidence-based model. I looked at it then. I really liked what I saw. I put that into legislative form back then. You know, at that time, again, we couldn't even get a committee hearing on it back then. Here we are today, and I'm very pleased to see that there's really been a lot of coalescing around this evidence-based model, and I think that's very significant. The education community, I think, if you know, as people interact with their school administrators and school board members over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of dialogue at a local level about the funding, you know, system in our state, the criticisms of it, and a lot of attention, I think, at a local level has been pointed at the evidence-based model as being a solution to that. So, you know, I can't speak for any of them, but I can say that it's their work that got me to where I'm at on this. I'm hopeful that they'll continue to show all the support that they've shown thus far, now that we're getting to this stage in the process. So there was a number of outcomes of the governor's funding reform commission. The report, and I don't have it in front of me, but the report, for those who, you know, kind of went through it in detail, the report said that there were items and areas where there was consensus, and then there were kind of the areas where there wasn't consensus. One of the items for which the commission received consensus, there was no objections, was that the charter school funding lacked parity, that there ought to be equal funding for students in charter schools as there are for our public schools. There was a discussion of this at the commission. You know, to paraphrase, the collective thoughts that I heard was that it's unfair that unequal funding applies to charter schools, and so we've incorporated, you know, that idea from the funding commission into the legislation here.
I know that Representative Davis and Menard want poverty concentration. Do you have that?
We do. Yeah, there are components of this that both weigh or account for children who grow up in low-income families and also children who live in areas which have high concentrations of poverty.
I mean, poverty concentration in the district, like the Tiffany County Schools, for extra resources going to districts with a high poverty concentration, which I think is not yet in Pensoneau or the state.
Right, so I'm saying we address those issues in this. Yes. This week. I mean, it's in a, yeah. I think because we're not in session, there's some logistics to how that happens, but we can get you copies of it right away. Yeah.
Can this formula change be done without a broader budget passed, and what are the chances of that happening?
Well, you know, yes. I mean, this can be done. You know, this is the mechanism for which money is distributed. The decisions of how much and when to distribute are obviously tangled up in that, you know, in the budget negotiations. I think it's important to have this tool in place first, so that we can get it in there, get it done right, so that when there's a budget, and specifically here a school budget, the mechanism is in place to push those funds through.
Next, from Springfield, we sit down with Rob Carr, the president and CEO of the Illinois Retail Merchants Association, as he explains why his association and other retailers oppose increasing the retail theft felony threshold. This runs about 15 minutes.
Rob Carr, thanks for joining us again on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Recently, we covered a press conference. We wanted to explore the ideas a little bit more. You were talking about a proposal by Chris Welch in the House to raise the level of when is theft, shoplifting, the dollar amount that becomes a felony.
Right.
And as I understand it, it's currently, what, $300?
It's currently $300 for retail theft, right? It's actually, there's a number of proposals, but Representative L.G. Sims and Representative Jason Slaughter have two proposals that are the central focus.
The primary ones.
Right.
And what would their bill, if that passed, where would that raise the level which constitutes a felony?
Well, Representative Slaughter's bill wants to take it to $2,500. So you could steal under $2,500 repeatedly and never be charged with a felony.
And it would be what, a misdemeanor, I guess?
It'd be a misdemeanor, right. Under the initial proposal that Representative Sims has been working on within the broader context of criminal justice reform, it's $2,000.
And their argument would be some of these people who are shoplifting are kids in high school or younger people, and once they get a felony conviction on their record, then it can ruin their life, because who wants to hire someone with a felony conviction? They may be prohibited from even applying for any number of jobs, because if it's in law enforcement or something and you have a felony conviction, they're not even going to consider you. A, are you sympathetic to that argument, and what's wrong with it if you think it's wrong?
We are sympathetic to the fact that kids make mistakes. There's no question about that. I think retailers in general are sympathetic to that effect, particularly if the parent or the guardian shows some responsibility as well, and some reaction that the youth in question has done something they should not have done. But we have also worked with advocates over a number of years to have diversion programs, to change the laws for ban the box so that those who have criminal convictions like this do not have to disclose them. We've worked with them on expungement and sealing. So IRMA, for almost the better part of a decade now, was for a long time the only business group engaging in those types of issues. Others have now started to, but we were early on in that process, and we continue to work with them on expungement and sealing type approaches.
At the $300 level, do we know how much retail theft, what's the total amount roughly? I'm sure it's somewhat of a guess, but...
It's a little bit of a guess, but we're running right in the neighborhood of $2 billion right now a year for Illinois. So you're losing somewhere in the neighborhood of $90 million in state sales taxes, another $20 million or so in locally imposed sales taxes, and I shouldn't say locally imposed, the state share of or the local share of the sales taxes. It's additional money if you calculate in if you have any locally imposed states or locally imposed sales taxes by the local unit of government. So it has a hit not only to the retailer, who can't recover their costs, because every item that walks out is something upon which we can't recover our costs to pay employees, property taxes, rent, to purchase the new products to replace the ones that have been purchased or stolen. It impacts local government's ability to provide services because they're out the sales taxes we just talked about, states out money. So it has a ripple effect. It is not a victimless crime.
And something, people who maybe haven't ever been in business don't appreciate, the vast majority of the retailers' costs, of a sale, let's say, they don't make money on that. So I think you had said previously that the average profit margin for retail is about 2%, is it?
In our last survey, which is a couple of years old, it was about 2%, right? But that sounds like a lot to some, but it depends what sector you're in. Electronics runs with a little higher profit margin, but they also run with a much higher cost carrying margin. In other words, the inventory they have to carry costs a whole lot more to carry than, for example, a grocer. But a grocer runs at about zero these days. So it's a little bit over the board, but 2% was the average.
So for every dollar, the retailer gets to keep 2 cents, and for the 2 cents, that's what he has left after he's paid salaries and utilities and taxes on the property and everything else.
Right.
So if I steal $100 worth of product out of a store, that's going to eat up like $1,000 or
no, it's cutting into
it's going to eat up $1,000 worth of sales just for you to for that $100 of loss. Right.
It's cutting it in there. It's making it harder to make that margin.
My math may be off a bit, but it's,
no. But your point is correct. It makes it harder.
The point is that people don't appreciate. It's not just that you're losing $100, it's that or $300, it's that you're losing thousands of dollars worth of sales, the profits on sales. You just wipe that out with a few $100 being stolen.
Yeah, because it has a ripple effect. You have to make more than, or you have to sell more of whatever is left to sell. And so it does have that ripple effect. The proponents also talk about need, that the theory is that much of the theft is for need. And that's simply not true. They also, what's really driving the whole debate, not only for retail theft but for criminal justice reform, is the prison population in Illinois, the desire to reduce it, and there is a bipartisan desire to reduce it, and reduce the costs associated with that, and the theory that prison ought to be reserved for those who are violent. We would generally agree with that, but I don't know that it should be exclusively for violent.
Have you had any discussion with the bill sponsors as to some middle ground, and if what middle ground is there?
Yeah, we have been talking with particularly Representative L.G. Sims, who's also chairman of the House Judiciary Criminal Committee, about the proposals, and we've had very productive discussions with him. We're looking at some alternatives to raising it, and we've been able to provide a lot of fact-based information that has completely countered the recommendations and some of the theory that was put out, for example, by the Sentencing Commission. And we can talk about that if you'd like, but in terms of retail theft numbers, whether they're rising or falling, and who's really in prison and who's not, and what they're in prison for and what they're not in prison for.
I should mention L.G. Sims is a former police officer, so it's not as if he's unfamiliar with criminal activity.
Right, and he's a relative, an attorney as well, so he is not. And we've had very productive discussions. I've known LG a long time.
What about those who would say, you know, why don't you, as retailers, just make it more difficult for people to steal?
Yeah, it's a great, they do. They invest a lot in loss prevention techniques, but criminals are endlessly creative. It's a lot of reaction, right? You try to anticipate what they're going to do, but it's hard to anticipate the criminal mind because a lot of people aren't wired that way. They don't think in that fashion, in that creative fashion. But they invest a ton of money in those types of efforts to stop retail theft.
Has it had an impact?
Oh, sure, it has an impact.
I mean, can we measure that the average sales stolen has gone down at all? Or?
No, because it's actually the retail theft numbers are actually increasing. So we've had other states around the nation have increased their felony thresholds over the last 5 years. And as they've done that, according to the FBI, retail theft has risen 17%, almost 18%. And the value of the merchandise has risen 30%. So the thieves are stealing more, and they're stealing to the threshold.
So now it's not a pair of blue jeans, they're going for the,
whatever they can...
whatever more expensive piece of... something.
Or more of the blue jeans, or, and that's a perfect segue into the whole theory of the need. The items that are most commonly stolen are not need-based items. High-end vacuum cleaners, for example.
They're what, reselling them on online or something themselves?
Resell them, take them to a fence. As somebody who specializes, another criminal who specializes in handling stolen merchandise. There's a return fraud as well. They print out fraudulent UPC symbols, those scanner codes that every product has, and they'll steal a high-end, let's say, vacuum cleaner that costs $400, and they'll put a UPC symbol on it that says it cost $700. They'll return it at a different store. They've pocketed, not only the $400 but the additional $300. And so there's a variety of ways in which they do this. But the interesting fact is that over 80% of the retail thieves who are caught have the money on them to purchase the product. So they're clearly not stealing for need.
When we, as you said, it went up 17%. Where does Illinois, with a $300 threshold, do you know how we compare with other states?
We have one of the lowest retail felony thresholds. Not the lowest, I don't think, but we're one of the lowest. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, though, in that circumstance, right? I think it sends an appropriate signal. We are a centrally located state. That is, we have a lot of borders, so it's easy to get to us. We have organized retail crime, which is a hyper version of retail theft. And we know that Illinois is often a targeted state for organized retail crime. You have gangs that literally roam from state to state, store to store, undertaking, stealing a lot of merchandise. They go in and sweep shelves, essentially, is what they do. So it's not inappropriate for Illinois to be higher, or to have that lower threshold.
Has anyone looked at, on the assigning, which is all this is about, the felony level, instead of making it on the amount of money being sold, has anyone discussed maybe it's a misdemeanor the first time, but if it's a second theft, then it becomes a felony?
We're talking about different approaches with the sponsor that might do that.
Somebody might do something stupid once, right?
Correct.
And with the put up to it by high school, a dare or something, but...
They might, but I think we have to be fair to our state's attorneys as well. They've done a pretty good job of determining who's really in that position and who's not. And the simple fact is that the stats would show us, it would indicate that those who are in prison for retail theft aren't there just for retail theft. I mean, according to the Sentencing Commission's own numbers, the typical thief that's in prison has 7 prior felony convictions and 13 prior misdemeanors. Now, the retail theft may be the recent trigger that put them in prison, but it is not because of retail theft. It is because they had these other priors, or they are currently under probation for a prior, is what put them there.
Where does this legislation stand at this point?
It's on second reading in the House for more discussion. The sponsor made that clear. He'd be coming back to his own committee with additional tweaks, because it's not just retail theft they're looking at. It's lowering felony thresholds across the board and other changes they want to make to try to lower the impact at the state level. But they have to be careful, because when California did this, California raised their threshold to $950. They had to come back $950. The California Assembly had to come back a year later and appropriate over $270 million to local government, because it just shifted the burden to local governments. So while it accomplished what California wanted on the state level and helped with their budget, it severely impacted the locals, which is why you referenced the press conference that initiated this interview. We had the Sheriff's Association standing with us and the Illinois Municipal League standing with us, because they get it not only from the experience in other states.
That they're going to lose.
Correct.
Right. And the other people they're going to lose are the legal shoppers, right? Because won't prices have to be increased to offset the losses?
Well, yeah, but there's a limit to how much you can do that as well. Because
you're competing,
competition.
I guess, online.
You're competing online. You're competing with other brick and mortars.
Which is the big, obviously Amazon is changing the whole world of retail, and one would think, unless it's organized crime behind the scenes, because of the nature of the way you shop with Amazon, they're not going to be facing retail theft.
Well, they're actually facing something a little different, and it's just starting to show up in a significant fashion. And it's you can argue about whether they're stealing from Amazon or the customer, but if a package is left on your porch, there's a spike now occurring in the number of reported thefts of that kind, where UPS, FedEx, someone has left a package on your porch, and your neighbor or a bypassing someone is swiping the package. They may not even know what's in it, but they know it's something.
As we sit here today, and speaking of Amazon, and we look around at different stores, the long and short of it is, with technology, this is probably the most challenging time of retail at all. I mean, here we have Sears Roebuck, which was the king of retail for decades, and now they're struggling to survive. So this all comes in the context of that environment where the local retail stores, which is still convenient for someone just to be able to go out and grab something right away. Maybe if they forget a birthday, you don't have time to wait for 3 days or something for an Amazon delivery. What do you hear from your retail members, large and small, about the environment in which they're trying to survive and compete, just in general, and obviously then any other losses are going to be even that much more damaging?
Sure. Well, that's what frustrates them, right? So retailers are your tip of the spear entrepreneurs, right? They're eternally optimistic generally about, or they wouldn't get into the business, because it's a tough business in retail, whether it's a restaurant or a grocery store or whatever it might be. It is a tough business. But they're eternally optimistic. But they face tremendous challenges, some of which you mentioned. Not only are they competing with fellow brick and mortar, they're competing with surrounding states, all of whom have lower cost impacts than does Illinois across the board. 2/3 of Illinois' population lives within a 40-minute drive of a border, so it's not hard for Illinois consumers to shop elsewhere, and we know that they do. But then they have the e-commerce impact as well. And you have the state of Illinois, which has a terrible fiscal situation. You have many municipalities around the state which have put themselves in terrible fiscal situations, particularly the city of Chicago and the county of Cook, which are significant players, both economically and population-wise for the state of Illinois. And then you have artificial mandates being put on, like $15 minimum wages, and then they want to hang what we would argue is an open for stealing sign around the neck of retailers by increasing the felony theft threshold to $2,000 or higher. It doesn't matter what you increase it to, it is sending a terrible signal to your brick and mortar retailers who are struggling to survive.
And lastly, should this make it out of the legislature, do we know where the governor is on this bill?
Oh, we do not know. He is generally inclined to, obviously I can't speak for him, but he is generally inclined to want to engage in criminal justice reform. It is his sentencing commission that produced a long list of recommendations, one of which was a recommendation to increase the felony theft threshold. Now, that did not receive a unanimous vote, and we have pointed out it was based on some flawed comparisons. For example, they talked about larceny. Well, larceny is a catch-all. We talk about retail theft numbers. So there's a difference in some of the facts they're using. I think he's inclined. Whether he would how he might act on something, I think we have to determine what ultimately gets to his desk.
Well, we'll continue to follow it, and Rob Karl, we appreciate you talking with us about it.
Always a joy. Thank you.
Thanks.
The Illinois Channel salutes our advisory council members, leaders in business, education, law, medicine, and other fields from across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Don Schaefer, Executive Vice President of Midwest Truckers Association. We represent over 2,700 member companies in 15 states who operate in Illinois. These men and women are responsible for keeping the food in your store, the fuel at your gas station, and bringing the books to your schools. In fact, look around the house and virtually everything you see will have been moved at one time or another by a truck. That's why our issues are your issues. Whether it's the taxes they pay, the price of fuel, or the regulations truckers must endure, in the end, you, the consumer, pay the price. That's one reason why I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel Advisory Council. Just as truckers deliver the goods on our nation's highways, the Illinois Channel delivers the information you need on your information highway. The Illinois Channel reaches 1.4 million cable homes across the state, as well as making their programming available as a video stream on their website at illinoischannel.org. Delivering the goods is Midwest Truckers' business. Delivering the information you need to stay connected to the actions of state government, that's the Illinois Channel's business. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Springfield, we talked to Taylor Pensoneau, a former reporter with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who covered Illinois politics, about his recollections of certain Illinois politicians, why nothing is getting done in Springfield, the effect of Illinois political power being concentrated in Chicago, and his advice for aspiring journalists. This runs about 1 hour.
Taylor Pensoneau, thank you for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Glad to be here with you, Terry.
It's been a while since we spoke. You are, for the audience, just to remind you, started out some 50-something years ago as a young reporter covering Illinois politics for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Right.
Subsequently worked as the head of the Coal Association, and for the last, 15 or so years have been an author and produced a number of books.
That's right.
Some of the historical figures that you covered as a reporter.
Right, right.
We thought it would be interesting as we look toward the bicentennial of the state of Illinois and celebrate 200 years that you covered a significant chapter and people who were significant in the development of where we are today.
Absolutely.
During your time as a reporter, we have this current state constitution written. Technology, as everyone knows, as far as the technology of reporting, has greatly transformed journalism. Let's start off just in the beginning. Let's go back to when was it that you started reporting for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch?
I came to the Post-Dispatch, Terry, in 1962, right after graduation from the University of Missouri School of Journalism. And I was, for 3 years, a general assignment reporter on the streets of St. Louis for the Post-Dispatch. And then in 1965, the Post decided to reactivate a dormant bureau in the press room in the Illinois State House. And they gave me an opportunity to fill that role. It was a terrific opportunity for a young guy, 24, 25 years old. And I started here in October of 1965. And for 12 years, I was the Illinois political writer for the Post-Dispatch up until early 1978, when I left the Post-Dispatch. I left big city daily journalism and accepted an offer to go to work for the Illinois coal mining industry.
When you were covering in the 60s, and again, what year did you just say you left daily reporting?
Early 1978.
So you had covered Otto Kerner as governor. Did you cover any of Bill Scranton as governor?
I did not. I got to know Bill Stratton, but I never covered him. No,
Yeah,
Otto Kerner was governor.
I misspoke. I may have misspoke.
Otto Kerner was governor when I arrived on the scene here.
Let's start with Otto Kerner,
Right.
Who later went to jail. We joke, kind of black humor about how many governors have gone to jail. A number of the governors who have gone to jail went to jail not as for what they did during their governorship necessarily, but some did and some didn't.
Well, one didn't, Dan Walker.
Dan Walker.
The others all went to jail
tied to their, well,
because of their governmental activities.
Governor George Ryan was more for what the Secretary of State, though.
Oh, okay, yeah. It was still a governmental situation, though.
Yeah.
But Dan Walker, his situation was completely divorced from his being governor of Illinois.
Right.
Yeah.
Otto Kerner, what kind of a governor was Otto Kerner? What kind of a man was he?
Otto Kerner was a genteel, debonair individual, always wore vested suits, very distinguished, was a scholar in every sense of the word, had been a top military officer. He demanded respect, and I was very impressed with him as an individual when I first arrived here. And I was very young, Terry, and I was impressionable at the start, okay? But Kerner was, as I said, he demanded respect. I got to know him, of course, to some degree. He was not close to the press. He didn't like press conferences, and he didn't like to answer questions from the press. He quickly would go on the defensive, I noticed, in his rare press conferences and so on. But one-on-one, I found him to be fairly cooperative and conducive to taking questions and so on. I was very, very disappointed later on in life, as were many other people, when he ran into trouble on a situation that occurred while he was still governor, but wasn't disclosed until a number of years later. It involved his acceptance of, in a secret deal of racing track stock in exchange for influencing the awarding of favorable racing dates to a Chicago family that had one of the big tracks up there. I think it was Arlington Park, and that was a stunner, and that was the beginning of the modern era of governors being convicted of felonies and going to jail. Kerner was the first. Actually, Stratton, of the last 11 Illinois governors, 5 have been indicted for criminal activity. Of those 5, 4 were convicted. The one who wasn't convicted was William Stratton, a Republican who was governor in the 1950s, and after leaving the governorship, Stratton was indicted for income tax evasion, but he was acquitted at a trial, so he obviously did not go to jail. The other 4, Kerner, Dan Walker, George Ryan, and Rod Blagojevich, all were convicted of the charges against them, and all went to prison.
And we had, others. Governor Edgar. There was. I want to say this politely because He was never accused, but there was a trial with one of some of his supporters. I mean, so the point I would make is we get into these situations where issues come up. And one of the things that I would ask you, it's not that we want anyone to be engaged in criminal activity of any sort.
Of course not.
But are we having these governors, in your estimation, as you said, 5 of the last, 11?
11.
Is that because people are more corrupt these days, or do you think the corruption was always there, but we now are just holding governors, we're not looking the other way any longer?
I think you've kind of answered your own question. I think the governors are under much more scrutiny now than they were, and there's always been a corruption factor at the highest levels of Illinois government, and that's true with most other states. But Illinois seems to have attracted a lot of attention for corruption at its highest level. I think that is because of several reasons. In Illinois, we've had aggressive U.S. attorneys in Chicago, and you know, people can often name U.S. attorneys in Chicago because they make names for themselves by indicting high officials, be it members of the Chicago Democratic machine, be it Illinois governors, or what have you. In a lot of other places in the United States, no one knows who the U.S. attorney is because they don't make names for themselves by indicting high government officials. So Illinois, the corruption factor has been accentuated by the fact that we've had aggressive United States attorneys in Chicago, Jim Thompson being one, of course, obviously.
Jim Thompson
right.
Became famous because he had indicted
Otto Kerner. Exactly. Now,
he was a federal judge, we should say. Kerner had been appointed to the federal bench by Lyndon Johnson.
Federal appellate judge. Right, incredible. Now, I also want to point out, though, to buttress what you just said a minute ago, that the behavior and the practices of some past governors are no longer being tolerated. And George Ryan is a good example. Many, I don't want to say apologists, but backers of George Ryan have said that he didn't do anything that a lot of his predecessors didn't do. And there is some truth to that, Terry, that
they changed the rules of the game on him, right?
They changed the rules, and George got caught in the middle of the stream, as they say, because some of the things for which he was indicted have been going on for years under other top Illinois officials, be they governors or secretaries of state or treasurers or what have you, attorney generals. But the U.S. Attorney in Chicago decided to draw the line on George Ryan and make an example of him, and of course he did. And that doesn't excuse the fact that George Ryan was convicted of a number of federal charges in respect to his governorship, and as you said, going back to his years as Secretary of State. But at the same time, some of the things for which Ryan was convicted were obviously practices in past administrations, and the numbers of those individuals were never called.
As you who have been involved in reporting on public policy for 50 years, is Illinois deserving of its reputation as one of the most corrupt states, or are we somehow just where we've changed the rules of the game and therefore all of a sudden we're filtering people through a different prism than we did before?
I think, unfortunately, Illinois is deserving of its reputation as a relatively corrupt state. I was not pleased, as were others, when Governor Blagojevich was indicted, and a top FBI official stood at a press conference in Chicago and said, because of this indictment and because of other things we're looking into in Illinois, Illinois may be surpassing Louisiana as the most corrupt state in the United States. Louisiana has a terrible reputation for corruption at the highest level. And for Illinois to be finally compared to Louisiana, I thought was the epitome of blackballing, blacklisting Illinois in terms of governmental corruption.
You know, in fact, a number of years ago, I was talking to Larry Sabato, the political science professor at the University of Virginia, when I was in Washington, and he said, I put Illinois right up there with Mississippi and Louisiana for the most corrupt state in the nation.
He included Mississippi, huh?
Yeah.
That's unusual. I don't hear Mississippi included as much as, not as much as Louisiana.
Yeah, and of course Louisiana sent some of their own, like Edwin Edwards, some of their own governors, past governors, to jail.
Oh, yeah, right.
And the Kingfish from back in the 30s.
Huey Long, right.
Huey Long. I don't want to run through, I mean, just, we could spend all day just talking individually about different people and governors, but it's not just governors. There are significant people in the legislature. When you look back over a 50-year period, who are some of the personalities that stand out, and why do they stand out?
Well, I would think that probably, just to get to the heart of it, of the governors I either covered or knew or dealt with in one way or another, I think Richard Ogilvie was frankly the most outstanding governor in my time. I think he will go down as one of the great governors in Illinois history. Just bouncing around, James Thompson was incredibly charismatic and was able to rise above partisan politics and pretty much get whatever he wanted out of government. He could get whatever he wanted out of, he was a Republican, but a very moderate Republican, a middle-of-the-road Republican, and he could get whatever he wanted out of the Democrats. And then you look at George Ryan. George Ryan, if not for his downfall on the federal prosecution and subsequent conviction, George Ryan might have gone down as one of our best governors because he pretty much could get whatever he wanted out of the General Assembly. He could reach across the aisle, although Republican, and get Democratic support for whatever he wanted. He had a close relationship at the time with Mayor Daley, the second Mayor Daley of Chicago. They were very close, and they had a good working relationship.
How was his relationship with Mike Madigan? Do you know?
It was passable. It was passable. George Ryan was an old-fashioned wheeler dealer. He came up the hard way through the hardball politics of Kankakee County and knew the ropes before he ever got to Springfield. And he could deal. He could deal with top Democrats. And Mike Madigan would be included in that. I think they liked each other, and he dealt with Mike Madigan.
So you had Jim Thompson, moderate Republican. Jim Edgar would be a moderate Republican as well. Right?
Jim Edgar was a very moderate Republican. Jim Edgar was a governmental practitioner. He of course had been a legislator, and he had worked for Thompson as his legislative liaison, and so on. And Jim Edgar knew politics. Jim Edgar, I think, was an exceptionally decent individual to have reached the highest rung of Illinois politics. I thought he was basically a nice guy, a nice gentleman. I've knew him for years, of course. And I think Jim Edgar was a case of an exceptionally decent, personally corrupt-free individual reaching the highest level of politics in Illinois. But he was not a backslapper, and he was not, to a lot of people, a warm individual. He was rather formal, and unlike George Ryan and unlike Jim Thompson, it would be an exaggeration, though, to say that Jim could get whatever he wanted out of Democrats, because that wasn't true. I know that I used to try to follow his relationship with Madigan, and I think it was hot and cold. But it wasn't the same relationship.
I'll insert that Governor Edgar has said that during the first 4 years, he served 8, that Madigan was a constant thorn in his side. But he goes, for some reason, Madigan took pity on me. I may have been putting words in his mouth, but their relationship warmed up during the last 4 years.
I think that's true. Yeah, I observed that, and I think that's true, that basically Madigan and Edgar could work out solutions to major problems, major issues affecting the state. And I know that I don't think there was any love lost between the two, because they were entirely different individuals in terms of where they came from and culture-wise and so on. But basically, Edgar, I think, was a live and let live individual, and a pragmatic fellow, and basically did a good job as governor of Illinois. There was the one scandal, but but I should point out that it did not touch him.
It did not
personally.
taint Governor Edgar.
And that,
right.
you got to, it did not. No,
right.
no. And you got to point that out.
Right.
And no governorship is free of one or more scandals, as we know. But
well, and anyone's going to raise an issue, right? I mean, they investigate in
Jim
Governor
Edgar gets high marks as a decent individual who did a good job and ran a responsible government, both financially and in dealing with issues and so on.
The other thing about Governor Edgar was he was a downstater. He was from Charleston area. And does that make a difference? I mean, we often hear about the divide between Chicago and downstate. Downstate virtually being anything besides Chicago and the collar counties.
Right.
When you go to Chicago, there is such a focus on the city and the city politics. It is very easy to fall into that mindset that you live in the state of Chicago.
No, that's true.
And then there's just this rest of this landmass that we call Illinois.
Right.
Does it matter, in your estimation, that a governor is a downstater versus someone from the Chicagoland area? When we look at the history of governors, so many of them are from Chicago.
Right. Well, I think it does matter. There's a historical, cultural divide in Illinois between the greater Chicago area and the rest of Illinois, so-called downstate. And it has always governed the way issues are addressed, the way government is conducted, and so on. And a downstater as governor is which we don't, it's hard to see again, as we sit here today. A downstater as governor sees things differently than a Chicagoan. You already said Chicago political leaders have a difficult time seeing a part of Illinois, I say south of I-80 around Joliet. Joliet is downstate to these guys, okay? And I think that there's always been a traditional downstate versus Chicago divide in Illinois. I think it's getting more pronounced. Chicago is gaining the upper hand in the situation because of the population disparity. You know, roughly 70% of the people in Illinois now live in the greater Chicago area. And the demographics are no longer there for downstate political individuals to exercise the say that they once did. There was a time when downstate could hold its own against Chicago in terms of political bargaining in the governmental scene in Illinois, in the General Assembly and in other ways. But we really don't have that anymore. Chicagoans are in a position where they can pretty much ramrod through anything they want now because they really don't need to bargain and get downstate votes on issues. And I think that's rather unfortunate.
Why does it matter?
Well, I think it
as a practical sense.
It matters because the constituents of downstate politicians, be they legislators or what have you, really don't care about heavy financing of Chicago public schools, for example, or subsidizing mass transit in the Chicago area. And there was a time when, and Chicagoans, for the most part, really could care less about poverty-stricken economic areas suffering downturns in much of downstate Illinois and so on. And they don't identify with a lot of downstate issues, be it agricultural, coal mining, or what have you. And I think that as long as we had some semblance of balance between the two, things could be worked out. But you know, downstate had a lot of political individuals who could deal with Chicago. And don't laugh when I say Paul Powell was one. Paul Powell did a lot of good for downstate Illinois in spite of the way his reputation ended up. But downstate doesn't have the Paul Powells anymore. It doesn't have the Clyde Shotes. And it doesn't have, we don't have governors from downstate. And so it's very difficult for downstate to get, in my opinion, fair representation in the halls of the State House. There are many parts of Illinois that, not just Chicagoans, but other downstaters don't know anything about. You've got counties in western Illinois, in the so-called Fregatonia area, that a lot of people couldn't even tell you what the names of the counties are, what the county seats are.
Well, I often point out to people, when's the last time we ever heard any news from Galesburg or Effingham or Mattoon? I mean, there are hundreds of communities across this state that might as well be on the dark side of the moon as far as the coverage that we ever hear of life in those communities.
Exactly, exactly. And as more and more of them are being represented by Republicans, that doesn't necessarily help their status in terms of the high-level dealing at the state level, where you've got Democrats dominating the House, dominating the Senate, and dominating elective offices, although right now we do have a Republican governor, Rauner. But, you know, we're getting into a classic divide where Chicago, of course, is a Democratic behemoth, if that's the right word. But downstate is becoming more, it's always been Republican, but now it's becoming even more Republican than it was. But again, this is interesting, but yet it's not favorable for downstate in terms of dealing at the state level, because we don't have the people, and we don't have the demographics to compete with and sit at a table with Chicagoans. And so, you know, we have this divide, basically, in kindergarten language: Democratic Chicago, Republican downstate. But it's not as simple as that. Democratic Chicago right now holds all the aces in their hand, if we're playing poker or whatever.
Yeah, I will point out, because as you and I talk sometimes when I do an interview, and this is one of them, I think of people watching this 50 years from now. I would point out that in the election of 2010, when we had Bill Brady, the Republican candidate for governor, running against Pat Quinn, who was a sitting governor, but anyway, Bill Brady won, I think, 99 out of 102 counties and lost the election. So it goes to show how concentrated the political power is. And my point would be that Illinois has a geographic problem. Because when you look at the political players that matter, there's only about 5 people in the state that hold significant political power.
That's right.
The governor, the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House, the president of Cook County, and the mayor of Chicago. And
throw in the assessor of Cook County just for fun. That's
yes, okay.
People often ask me as an aside here, who are the most powerful individuals? What are the top 3 most powerful offices in Illinois? And I have an answer, and it's not a total joke. Number 1, Mayor of Chicago. Number 2, the assessor of Cook County.
And why do you say that?
Oh, the assessor of Cook County gets to appraise all the values of all the
property to be
buildings and the
taxed.
properties in Chicago. And gosh, look at what we're talking about. And number 3, governor.
Well,
that's kind of a joke.
And I don't mean this as a slight to any of the people currently in office.
Right.
But when you have this much concentration of power, if you're the minority leader in the House or Senate, you're not really, you have the title, but you don't have the political power to affect change.
You do not. Not as we sit here today in early 2017. What you said is exactly right. We do not have a balance of power in either chamber, legislative chamber, that really is necessary to address issues in a fair way that takes into account the concerns and needs of all parts of the state, not just the greater Chicago area.
I grew up in St. Louis. You worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, as we said. I often point out in this regard that if you were from the proverbial man from Mars and were trying to find a place to colonize, you would point out to your boss, I found a place in the richest nation on earth, on the biggest river in that country, smack dab north, south, east, west in the middle of the country. It has heavy rail, light rail, barge traffic, major highways going right past it, and major airports. And that's great. What is it? East St. Louis. And it's true.
I know.
And yet East St. Louis, for those who haven't been there, sits there and rots. It is an economic development officer's dream in many ways, as far as what assets are there to work with. And I would argue that this is a reflection that it sits there and rots of the concentration of power being so much in Chicago, with the Chicago blinders on what issues matter. that no one cares about in East St. Louis. And it's reflective, not to make it just about East St. Louis, but when you can overlook something like that and have it sitting there rotting
Right.
for decades,
Right.
it is reflective of the imbalance of power and how that manifests itself in a practical sense in life
Right.
in Illinois
Right.
at this point in time.
Ironically, you mentioned East St. Louis. And of course, I had to pay particular attention to East St. Louis in my reporting years for the Post-Dispatch, obviously.
Right.
And in my years, one governor went out of his way to try to help East St. Louis and temporarily did a lot of good for the city, and that was Republican Richard Ogilvie. And that's unusual because Ogilvie did far more to address the real problems of East St. Louis than any other governor in my lifetime. And
what did he do, and why did it?
Well, he for example, he set up he pushed through legislation to create a community college in East St. Louis that didn't get any local funds. It was totally financed by the state. That was most unusual. The only higher educational institution, it was a 2-year community college that didn't depend on local taxes. There were no taxes assessed for it. That would have been an example. He went along with a lot of building projects in East St. Louis, capital projects that weren't done. On that, he cooperated with the federal government and so on. He did other things. He appointed East St. Louisans to key positions, and he gave the city a degree of respect in regard to the people coming out of it and so on. He was there a lot. For a while, East St. Louis had a Republican mayor while Ogilvie was governor, and he did a lot to try to ease. He addressed the racial relations in East St. Louis, and it was going through a catharsis at the time, a violent transformation from being a biracial city to one that is essentially all black. But that was not an easy thing to handle and deal with, and Ogilvie did a good job there, as good as he could at the time.
And of course, we should point out he was a one-term governor.
And he was a one-term governor, good point. And since then, no governor, in my estimation, has given East St. Louis any extraordinary consideration, nothing out of the ordinary, and East St. Louis has continued to plummet to debilitation, and what we have today is one of the major decrepit eyesores among municipalities in the United States.
There's many things. You're a fascinating guy, and there's a lot of issues, and we're never going to have enough time.
No.
So I want to move along just to some other areas. Again, you started out as a journalist. You've been covering these issues. You've written books. Biographer of Governor Ogilvie, so you're well informed. Also of Russell Arrington, who is a major Republican senator and a powerhouse. Tell us just briefly, and I want to get into the state of journalism a bit as well.
Right.
But who was Russell Arrington, and why did he matter?
Russell Arrington was one of life's great success stories. Poor kid, grew up poor, born in Gillespie, Illinois, actually, who made it big as a lawyer in Chicago, became a wealthy lawyer during the Depression years in the 1930s, when he became very schooled with handling bank foreclosures and bank failures and things like that. Got involved in politics, Republican politics, as a young man up on the North Shore, and eventually decided, was a big success as a lawyer, was a big success in business, but decided he wanted more. And he ran for and eventually got elected to the Illinois House in 1944, served 10 years in the House, and then got elected to the state Senate in the mid-50s. And it was there that he really came into his own. He decided to make his mission in public life his mission was to make the General Assembly a more meaningful branch of government. And Arrington, who was a very cold, callous individual, but
not warm and fuzzy.
Not warm and fuzzy, oh no, anything but. And very mercurial, very hot-tempered and so on, decided when he was at the helm in the Senate, he then was at the helm of a big Republican majority in the state Senate that could pretty much do what it wanted. He decided then to forge and drag the General Assembly into the 20th century and make it a more meaningful part of government. For example, the General Assembly only met every other year. It was a biennial situation. Arrington was the one who brought about annual sessions of the General Assembly. Arrington was the one who forged annual budgeting. Arrington was the one who, for the first time, made the General Assembly run on time. Committees met when they said when they were going to meet. They reported out bills. He imposed deadlines that were met, and so on. He actually turned the General Assembly into
from a fraternity house into a professional organization.
In a professional organization, and it did become a much more important part of Illinois government on a day-to-day basis. He wanted it to be more functioning on a day-to-day basis. Now, a lot of people argued with this, of course, and felt that wasn't the intent of the General Assembly.
Well,
he was the one who made what we now have in Illinois a full-time General Assembly, a full-time legislature.
I was going to say, the lawmakers pay, am I not right? They used to get their entire salary on the first day.
I guess I've heard that. I'm not sure about that.
And then, so they didn't necessarily feel that they had to come in.
The pay wasn't very much.
Or come all the way down to Springfield.
No.
These days, well, as we speak, they're not even getting paid on time, but that's somewhat. Let me say this.
Arrington ran, though, the Senate with an iron hand.
Did he ever want to be governor?
He talked about it, but he was never sincere about it. For one thing, he had this prickly personality, and he would not have been a good campaigner statewide.
He wouldn't suffer fools gladly. Huh?
Oh, you couldn't put it any better. In fact, that's a phrase, I'm his biographer, of course, and I put in there that he did not suffer fools lightly. And it didn't matter whether you were a fellow Republican or a Democrat or an independent. If you screwed up, Arrington was merciless in coming down on you, and he always did it in front of everybody. He didn't do it behind the scenes. I was reporter in those years, Terry, and I would be sitting in the Senate press gallery covering it, and you always knew if it was a slow day covering the Senate, you were going to have a story to write before it was over, thanks to Arrington, the Republican leader, who was running the show from the floor. And Arrington would, if someone screwed up or someone was out of line or someone hadn't done what he or she was supposed to do, Arrington would give them a tongue lashing in front of everybody, fellow Republicans, Democrats, and so on. The joke was Arrington always had a big cigar, okay? And there was a tip-off. If he had the cigar in his mouth and it started going up and down in a nervous fashion, that was wonderful because you knew somebody was in for a tongue lashing. Somebody had screwed up, and that was the clue that Arrington was ready to lash out at somebody. And everybody, all the other senators would be looking down at their desks. No one wanted to look up because no one wanted to be the target of his tongue lashing. But no, Arrington succeeded partly because people were afraid of him. He was a multimillionaire. He didn't need the money. He wasn't on the take, but he was very arrogant and very demanding, and so on. And for a time, under Arrington, the General Assembly ran like a very smooth machine back in his time. In fact, Speaker Madigan had told me in interviews for my book on Arrington that Arrington was his model for a legislative leader, and that he thought in many ways he was modeling his speakership after the leadership portrayed by Arrington when Arrington was in the saddle.
While as you said, you literally wrote the book on Arrington, so all of these people we could talk about for an hour, but let's go to, we would be remiss if we didn't speak about Michael Madigan, who's been the speaker for all but 2 years for the last 34 years or so.
Incredible.
At the end of this term, as we tape this, he will be the longest serving speaker, I think, in the history of the United States. Mm-hmm. What is your take on Michael Madigan?
Michael Madigan is obviously an incredible individual. Number one, he's very smart, and I've often felt when he gets into these contests with other individuals, sometimes it's not fair because Madigan is so smart and so schooled and so researched and so up to date on everything going on that the people who might challenge him are just not up to it. in a crude term, Terry, most of them are not as smart as Madigan, so that's a big handicap to begin with, okay? Madigan is absolutely unbelievably efficient in marshaling power and using it. And I think that it was said that you take in redistricting and things like that, in which he's had an upper hand for years, you know, he knows in each district what, in each county, and this is downstate too, where Democratic votes are, where Republican votes are. He is so shrewd. He knows the backgrounds of every individual in the General Assembly. He knows their strengths, he knows their weaknesses, and he can play upon these, and that's what a powerful leader does. You've seen it in Congress through the years, and you see it in the Illinois General Assembly. He is he's extremely studious, and he concentrates, and I would say he's all business. And many are writing now that his main intent, his main occupation, his preoccupation is simply the maintenance of power. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
I was going to ask, what motivates him?
Well, obviously, he wants to be, wants to go down as perhaps the most powerful legislator in I guess,
I mean, if someone asked me,
history, you know?
If someone asked me from covering the State House, what is Michael Madigan's agenda? I don't know what his agenda is. He's not. I know where Governor Rounder talks about his agenda. Michael Madigan doesn't talk about it.
There's not an ideological agenda where Michael Madigan is concerned. Number one, you retain power, and when you have the power he has, then you can get things done. And then he can pick and choose which issues of the day he wants to address. And if he goes into something seriously, there are many instances through the years, during his many years in power, where Madigan has forged, worked out, maneuvered a very reasonable solution to a difficult problem plaguing state government or plaguing the citizens of Illinois. But on the other hand, he's a very stubborn individual. He is not used to being challenged. He doesn't like to be challenged. And his back gets up, the hair on his neck gets up pretty quick when someone takes him on, or he perceives someone to be taking him on. And that can bring about the kind of situation we have now, where I think it's a very personal standoff between Democrat Madigan and Republican Governor Bruce Rauner. And I think that it's gotten down to a place where the interests of the state are temporarily, and the populace are temporarily shoved aside, or put on a shelf for the time being, while we work out this circling, this duel between two incredibly powerful and obviously stubborn and intent on winning individuals, Madigan and Rauner.
I was going to say, this is, would I be right in saying that this is devoid of politics? It is a personality power struggle.
Oh, a personality power struggle is certainly part of it. There's no question about that. Because Rauner is a certain kind of individual that Madigan
and Madigan has never had an opponent of this
time abiding, right?
Of this caliber.
No, Madigan's never had anybody in his peak years of anybody attempting to stand up to him like this. So,
and able to block. They're blocking each other. We have two immovable forces.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And as a result, we have Illinois held hostage.
That's right.
What does it say, going back to what you were saying about Jim Thompson and Jim Edgar and George Ryan, Republican governors who worked with Mike Madigan?
Right.
I'm trying to phrase this in a neutral way, but what does it say about that things still moved through the state? We had budgets, we got things done. That today we find ourselves where we are, where nothing's getting done.
Well, you say, why are we here? Because Rauner was elected to try to address some serious situations in Illinois, mainly the huge fiscal deficit in which we find ourselves in Illinois. And you can't blame Rauner for that. I mean, okay, well, I think we can agree on that.
The state was messed up before Rauner came into office.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, Speaker Madigan is undeniably part of the situation, maybe a major part of the situation that has led us to our financial impasse, our financial crisis in which we find ourselves in Illinois. Rauner is, you know, has wanted to take the bull by the horns, and on this score, I think that Rauner should deserve some credit for trying to change things. Now, I mean, also, we have this situation where he's insisting on certain reforms in terms of the business climate and so on. And here in Illinois, and the press included, depicts him as wanting radical changes, right to work, property tax freezes, and so on. If you want to be fair here,
redistricting and term limits.
Yeah, right. If you look around in other parts of the Midwest, no further than Indiana, now Missouri with right to work, Rauner's not asking for anything that is really radical or that has already not been put in place to a great extent in states bordering Illinois. Wisconsin, Indiana. Governor Kasich has accomplished a lot of this in Ohio. In Missouri, even where we've had a Democrat in the governor's chair, many of the business reforms
now a Republican.
Now a Republican, but the Democratic governor in Missouri, though, was in accord with a lot of the so-called business reforms that Rauner's wanted. So it's not that Rauner has this radical agenda. That's not the case. If you look at the fact that much of what he wants has been adopted, again, in Missouri and Iowa and Wisconsin and Indiana and Ohio.
Well, as I say, in a tug of war, you can't blame one side for pulling on the string, right?
Good way to put it. Good way to put it.
But at what point do we do so much lasting damage? I mean, we have these two people butting heads, and in the meantime, we're driving different people out of business.
Right.
We're doing just all kinds of damage, you know, to nonprofits who provide social services, to people running a pizzeria place in some of the college towns where the students are now not going there because of the budgetary problems and woes. It might take years to build a building, but you can burn it down in a half an hour.
That's right.
You know? Is that? I mean,
that's right.
So I don't know what. I would say for the historical record, there's a lot of frustration right now about where Illinois is. I don't even know that I have a question to add to that.
Absolutely.
It is something I would say relative to your 50 years experience that we have not faced before.
Oh, absolutely not. No. I have never seen anything like this before. These guys are breaking new ground every day with this situation as it continues year after year.
And doesn't it not somewhat point out that maybe we need political reforms because we have too much power vested in too few?
I agree with that. I
mean, all the backbenchers in the legislature are frustrated too.
Yeah.
Of both
course
parties.
they are. Of course they are. Of course they are. And I think that it's a shame that a lot of individual legislators don't assert themselves more. I mean, they are independently elected, and they represent.
We saw what happened to Kenny Duncan when he did.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's
a Democrat who broke with the speaker and was quickly
right.
dispensed.
That's a fair point to bring up. But I think that several things have happened. The so-called cutback amendment that was pushed through by then political activist Pat Quinn back in 1980.
Can we back up? Because I wanted to bring that up.
Okay,
but let's, one of the things, I've never heard of this before as a student of government, and this happened before I was in Illinois. But we had, as a state, 3-member districts, which I have never heard of, as I said, in any other state anywhere else. But a lot of people that I've talked to who recall that spoke favorably of it.
It was the so-called cumulative voting system, where in each House district, the majority party in the district elected 2, but the minority party always had 1 of the 3 seats. And that gave the minority party a voice, and it meant that the leadership of the House couldn't be as autonomous and all-powerful as it is now. That cutback amendment eliminated the cumulative voting system. It reduced the number of reps, and it introduced single-member districts. And the biggest effect of it has been to make the speakership an all-powerful office. It actually ended up enabling the
and
speakership.
I want to explain why that is. Because before, when you had 3-member districts,
right,
then even in the city of Chicago, you would have Republican state representatives.
Yes, you did. Now, sometimes, I will tell you this,
they were Democrats
in disguise.
Yeah.
Okay, but still.
They really were rhinos.
But, right? But your point is well taken. And
conversely, you had Democrats in heavy Republican
downstate, heavy Republican areas. You always had one Democrat. And it served to really diffuse the situation and not let any one party have complete power. And that was important, you know. And you didn't have the lopsided situation that you've had now or have had for a number of years. And once again, it provided for a leadership situation in a House where you had to take into consideration all concerned. The Democrat may be in the speakership, but Republicans could not be ignored and vice versa. But by eliminating that cumulative voting system, it allowed the leadership in the House to become all-powerful. And I think that in looking back, that's probably not been a totally good thing.
One of the things I really wanted to talk about as well, and again, we're already going long, but let's get to the state of journalism.
Right.
We had talked when you and I first broke into journalism. We would write our stories on typewriters.
That's right.
And among the changes, and one of the primary ones, which is certainly having an impact on the world of journalism, is the technology and the impact that's having on existing business models. It's obviously breaking down newspapers. It's breaking down radio stations. Right, people can put out their own podcasts. Someone like the Illinois Channel doesn't have to have a broadcast box with an antenna.
Right.
So we can distribute video across platforms. So it's both good and bad. Yeah. The bad part is to the extent that it's breaking down old business models, and a lot of journalism entities are withdrawing their reporters from the state capitol and covering it.
And I think that's a shame. I think the public is ill-served by the decreasing importance, relevancy of the press room in the Illinois State House. I'm a throwback to another era, as you know, Terry. I wrote my stories on a typewriter. Can you believe it that I went and filed stories at night at Western Union?
To send the story down to
Western Union sent my
Louis.
stories to St. Louis. Now, that's really going back. That's like saying I'm from the Pony Express era.
Yeah.
I'm not quite that old, but it is a valid comparison. When I came here, the press room was a very vibrant situation. You had 4 major Chicago dailies competing every day for stories, not just the Tribune and the Sun-Times. You had the Chicago Daily News, and you had the Chicago's American, later Chicago Today. And they competed daily. You had more than one. You had not just the Associated Press. You had the United Press International. You had several independent news services like the Chamberlain Loftus News Service. You had freelancers who served different papers. They were here and were making a living. You know, many of the, you had the 2 St. Louis dailies had bureaus here. Not
the Globe
just
Democrat
the
and the
Globe
Post
Democrat
Dispatch.
and the Post Dispatch.
One Republican, one a Democratic paper.
Yeah, now I will say...
now the Post wouldn't say they were Democrat.
I worked for a Democratic paper, no question about that, but I tried to be fair, believe me.
Right.
Okay. But, you
editorially,
know...
on the editorial page,
but you had like the Lindsay Schaub chain and a lot of individual papers had folks here on an almost daily basis. And
so now that we're not, what I mean, you know, this right as we sit here, we had this spring, I think, 5 reporters leaving the Illinois State Capitol Press Corps. There used to be, you might have 30 reporters there, and now we're getting down to like we have 12 or so.
When the General Assembly was in session, you had 25 to 30 reporters here because Rockford would be here, Peoria would be here.
Not anymore.
Waukegan would be here, and so on. And no, not anymore. And Champaign-Urbana, they would all be here, you know, and you don't have this anymore. And I think this is a shame because you don't have...
this sounds a little bit like belly aching of reporters for their... But it's more than that because we are losing the tenuous thread that connects us to what's going on in public policy.
Right. Well, what is happening is that I really fear, I'm a print journalism guy, obviously. I'm an old newspaper guy, so I'm prejudiced in favor of newspapers. That's my life story. Right. Okay. I really fear, Terry, for the future of print journalism. I really do, especially in terms of the big city dailies. There are more reasons I feel for this than we want to go into today. Now, I think papers in middle-sized situations will survive, like the Wayne County Press and Pana and the Southern Illinois and so on. But the big boys, the big folks, are facing a uncertain future. You go through the offices of a lot of newspapers today, and you see empty cubicles all over the place. It's not just the State House press room, it's in the home offices of the newspapers. They don't, and state government coverage, since that's what we're talking about here, has suffered greatly. I was part of an incredible investigative era in State House journalism from the mid-'60s up until the late '70s, and we don't have that anymore. And in my time here, I was part of it, but there were a lot of good investigative reporters. Some of the best in the country came out of our State House here, and we really set a model for State House investigative reporting in the Illinois State House. And I've written about it, and I mention it in all my books, and I rehash it whenever I can because I was very proud to be part of a golden era of State House journalism here in Illinois.
Well, and I was going to say,
we don't have that anymore.
Right. I want to point out. I mean, just to point out something that's rather maybe obvious, but the nature of the news business is there's good TV stories, there's good radio stories, there's good print stories. A budget story is not a good TV story because you can't talk numbers, and if people remember them, but you can read the numbers.
Right.
But TV, which typically does a package story that's a minute and a half to 2 minutes long, is not a good medium to do investigative reporting.
Right.
And people don't want to put the reresources, the ownership doesn't want to put the resources to have someone work on a story for months that is needed to uncover whether it's corruption. Let me jump ahead I mean, you can respond to that, but let me just ask something else and maybe weave this in. The other thing that happened during your era and mine was the Watergate story, which to me changed journalism because
it did.
Before then, let me say after Watergate, and with the fame that came to investigative reporting from Woodward and Bernstein, you had all sorts of people who wanted to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, and their idea of journalism was that they were going to look for corruption, which is fine, but I think it also accentuated a different attitude in journalism, that there was more hostility, more of a confrontational journalism than a mere reporting. Am I right in that?
No, you're right about that. You're right about that. No, I pointed out...
is that a good thing or a bad thing, or what? How should journalists?
I think it's neither all good nor all bad. I think it's
professionally. How should they behave themselves?
Well, I think basically you still got to approach coverage in a fair and balanced fashion, not to be trite in my use of words. And I think that what we're seeing today is advocacy journalism. I'm not going to get into the national situation. We've just elected, as you and I sit here, Donald Trump as President of the United States. But I think that regardless of how you feel about Trump, I think you're seeing an aggravated sense of what you've just talked about, of where the journalism community on a whole is very aggressively negative towards Trump. And that's just my opinion. I know...
I would think any objective observer would say that.
When people watch this, they may argue, but I'm going to say that. It's not whether
I think
you agree with
some
Trump or
people
not,
would argue that they should be, but I think it's hard to argue that they are not. I think they are.
There's very little objectivity in the coverage of Trump, and I think this is going to further diminish the role of the media in its responsible role in our American democracy, Terry.
People won't see it as
I think it's a shame what we're seeing now. This doesn't mean you don't go into all the foibles and the misstatements of Trump and all that stuff, but to deliberately try to assassinate the man with straight news stories and so on, this is going to backfire. You know, before the election, and now we're talking nationally for a second, before the election, I was asked by several downstate papers to prophesied what was going to happen. And I'll admit to you, I predicted Hillary Clinton would win. I said it might be closer, though, than a lot of people think. But I said, regardless of who wins, a loser is going to be the media. And I really stick by that, and I think that's true. And I think that this lack of confidence in the media and what people are watching is only going to further downgrade the necessary responsible role of an honest media in our democracy, and I think that's a shame.
What would you say to journalism schools in the training of journalists, as far as, or just to journalists people who aspire to be journalists? What would you say to them as far as, here's how you should conduct yourself?
Well, I went to a journalism school, Missouri, University of Missouri, and I was taught the basic, it was stressed there that you have to be fair and balanced. The Post-Dispatch was a very liberal paper on the editorial page and so on, but the editors of the Post-Dispatch, who basically molded me, whatever I've done has been because I've been molded by the editors of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. They insisted on fair and balanced coverage. There was never, the situation was never all black or all white. There was always a middle ground, and you never wrote a story where it was all on one side and so on. There was always two sides to every story. And I just felt that we need more of that. I don't know, I'm not familiar, I've been away from journalism schools for a long time. I've not been to a journalism school for decades. I don't know what they're being taught. I do know that there's a very, here we go, there's a very liberal slant on college campuses. There's no arguing with that. And I think it probably pertains to the journalism schools as well as to other aspects of major university campuses. I just think that there's got to be more emphasis on, you approach a situation never with an axe to grind ahead of time or with an edge or whatever. You've got to have an open mind, and I just don't see that in terms of a lot of individuals. I think you take these young PAR folks that come through
Public Affairs Reporting
folks that come through the program out at UIS and so on, and I know I speak to them every year, as do some other individuals and so on, and in talking with them, it's obvious they're all Democrats. Well, this is fine. At one time, I probably was a young Democrat myself, but I didn't let it show. And
I think your point would be, you don't want to be. Whether it's okay to be a Democrat.
Yeah.
The problem is if you don't give the other side their due and listen.
Absolutely.
I just had an intern from one of the primary journalism schools send me an article as an example on sanctuary cities. Well, there was nothing in the article, and I didn't publish it on their website.
Right.
There was nothing at all in that article about why one would be opposed to a sanctuary city.
About the negative aspects of sanctuary cities.
And I said, you have to be.
I know.
There's other sides to the story. So
that's the only point
this is the problem that you get.
This is the problem, and you diagnose it very accurately. You know, you've got to present both sides. Even a situation may appear one-sided, and we're not seeing that right now. And I think that, again, the biggest victims of what we're seeing are not going to be cable news, not going to be TV or radio. It's print journalism, and it's going to be the big city dailies. And I really question the future of, and I may live to regret this, but of the future of the New York Times and the Baltimore Sun and so on and so on and so on.
Well, and then we can only speculate what happens to our functioning democracy. Now, as the Illinois Channel is one example, there are a myriad of other media. So on one hand, you don't have the people that used to be the gatekeepers to information. As when you and I were growing up, we had 3 networks, and that was all you have. Now you have MSNBC, Fox News, Fox Business News,
good point,
CNN. So you can get different,
and that's all to the good.
That's all to the good, and you can get some diversity of reporting, diversity
you certainly do.
Of opinions. So plus you have the bloggers, and the bloggers were the ones that exposed the flaws in Dan Rather's report on George W. Bush some years ago. So we don't make it sound like we're just belly aching about the good old days. That's not the point. Technology changes.
Of course, of course.
But you still have to have some fundamentals of journalism, right? As far as reporting facts.
Even with all the technology.
Giving people their due, giving both sides.
And all the digital miracles, you still got to have an honest, open-minded approach to coverage of a situation. That can't change, in my opinion.
Now, Taylor Pensoneau, we could speak for hours. We've already spoken a lot longer. There's a lot to cover, and it was 50 years. I hope we can do it again sometime, but thank you.
I'd love to, Terry.
Thanks for your time. You're a wealth of information, and we'll recommend the books that you've written for people who want to know more.
Well, that'd be great.
All right. Thanks again.
Thank you, Terry.